We have here today Professor Eric Gans from UCLA, Department of French, who has kindly agreed to talk to us about his memories of Professor René Girard and how he met him and how he encountered him and how Professor Girard influenced him. So let me start off by asking you, how did you first learn about Professor Girard and how did you first come across working with him?
Well, I may be somewhat of an exception among the people you're interviewing in that when I met Girard, I'd never heard of him. He was still a fairly young scholar and he hadn't yet published Mensonges Romantiques. So when I went to Johns Hopkins, I went there on the advice of my professors at Columbia. I was rather young and they thought I would be happier at Hopkins, which was a smaller place than Yale, where I was also accepted, but they told me I probably wouldn't be happy at Yale. They might have been right. But so when I went to Hopkins, they had a professor there they thought I should work with, but that's not relevant. But it seemed, as soon as I saw Girard as a professor, it wasn't much chance that I would work with anyone else. For one thing, he was in my field. I was interested in the 19th century novel. And in that very small department, he taught the 19th and 20th century literature and thought and so on. And he was a stimulating and dynamic professor and much more interesting to listen to than anyone else. And also a man of great personal charm. But and anyway, so I never had any doubts about working with him, even though politically I probably would have done better to work with this other older professor who was, more part of the profession. But I never regretted for a minute working with René. And I can say that he was very helpful to me as a dissertation director. And throughout my early career, we also, he didn't have that many students, so we had spent much time together. And we always got along very well. And I was always very impressed with his, his thought.
Ask you, what year was this when you went to Johns Hopkins?
I went to Johns Hopkins, it was 1960. I graduated from Columbia in 1960. I was still just there, I wasn't even, I just turned 19 that summer. So I was and I'd never really been outside of New York City, aside from a few little trips. So just going to Baltimore was quite a change. It was segregated in those days, it was something that really shocked me. I didn't realize there were restaurants where you couldn't. But in any case, I was, he was the highlight, I thought, of the department. And I don't think, as the future showed, I think that was a correct assumption. But so so I have the pleasure of saying that I didn't go there because of his reputation. I sort of discovered him on the basis of just contacting him and seeing how he operated in the classroom.
Right.
And his book, by the way, Mensonges Romantiques came out in 1961, was the spring of the year I was there, my first year there. And of course, Hopkins was a small department and it was much more companionable than in the bigger places. And the students and professors often discussed things. So when his book came out, people would talk about it and we had, meetings and so on. It was very informal. So, it was it made this sort of a sensation because it was obviously a very interesting book. But in my own relationship with him, that book was not that influential. When I wrote my dissertation, I was obviously somewhat influenced by it, but my thinking was really began to be influenced by Girard after I read his second major book, which was Violence and the Sacred, or La Violence et le Sacré, because I saw how he developed his theory of desire into an anthropology. And, it was that book formed the main source of my whole theory of generative anthropology, although, there are obviously some differences. In other words, the basic idea that violence is the source of the human because the human has to contain its own violence. I think that's really a very simple idea, which in a way all religions support, and yet no anthropologist had ever quite put it in those terms.
So let me track a little bit. So what did you write your dissertation on?
I wrote my dissertation on the early works of Gustave Flaubert. I had originally had this, ambition. I was going to write about Flaubert's entire career, but I started at the beginning, and when I got the first couple of years of these early works, you may not be familiar with them, although now they're available online. You can look at the original manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale. But in any case, there were some publications about these, so that the manuscripts were available in print in any case, even if not in text. And they were very interesting works, because he wrote these things when he was about 14, 15, and they're very romantic. So you can see the process of his overcoming of the romantic attitude, which was so central to his whole philosophy of art and so on. And it was quite enlightening. But anyway, it was later published. I called it The Discovery of Illusion. And, he was an excellent director. He always gave me good advice. He never tried to push his own ideas, even though he said he thought he detected some traces of them, which I'm sure he did. But he was, I couldn't imagine a better director. And I was living, of course, I wasn't living in Baltimore. We had to do everything by, sending mail and actually using pieces of paper. But it was, he made the thing as easy as possible. And then when I went back to Hopkins for my defense, because in those days they had a thesis defense, it was a very friendly meeting, and I remember Lucien Goldman, the Marxist theorist, was present there at the time as a guest of the department and so on. So it was but he was always, I say, very friendly and helpful throughout the early part of my career.
Do you remember any piece of advice he gave you while you were writing your dissertation?
Well, he at one point he said that I was writing like a dandy, that I was keeping my ideas to myself, that I should write a clearer and more, I should avoid the sort of préciosité that certain, especially in those days, was quite common. But, and I always took that seriously, and I also recognized it in his own writing, unlike some of these other thinkers, some of whom are, I think, of great value, but nevertheless, there's this sort of, snobbery about not being too clear, and that a lot of people appreciated, because then you could quote them and you say, what does that mean? Someone like Lacan is probably the most extreme case. Well, but even Derrida, certainly, despite, I think, what I consider as a great thinker, despite that, he certainly gave into that, and I thought basically regrettably, because Girard always said what he meant, whereas he wanted me to be explicit, and I think I took his ideas to heart. I try to write clearly.
At Johns Hopkins, then, when the big symposium took place, the symposium of...
no, I wasn't, actually. It's an interesting coincidence. I got my PhD that year, 1966, but I didn't really know. I was living in in New York State. I was teaching, and I was completely out of touch with Hopkins in those days, and I really had almost no knowledge of that famous colloquium, which I really learned about afterwards, and Girard never talked to me about it. I'm not even sure what time of the year it took place, but in any case, I just went down there for my defense and then came back. But
I see.
I learned, I'd say I learned later. I mean, there are a lot of ironies associated with that event, in particular the fact that Girard was instrumental in putting together the whole world of French theory. And yet, if you read about French theory, his name is likely not even to be mentioned.
That's true.
Derrida, Lacan, Deleuze, and so on, but and Foucault. But actually, Girard was instrumental. I've written recently about the fact that French theory really should be understood as having two branches. And what I think that generative anthropology does is bring together the two branches, although without all the tomfoolery that you find in the, among the most of the French theoreticians, all that préciosité, which I think is based on the fact that they can't say what they mean, because what they're trying to do is transcend metaphysics within metaphysics. Whereas Girard, being essentially a man of religion, he didn't need metaphysics to express himself. I think that was his real strength.
Right. So what exactly are the two branches of literary theory that you're talking about? One is metaphysics and the other one is anthropology? Is that what you're referring
to? One is the attempt to get beyond metaphysics. In other words, it's sort of paradoxical, anti-metaphysical metaphysics that I think Girard, that I think Derrida embodies most clearly and most importantly. That the whole idea of what he calls deferral and so on,
sure.
La différence, the idea that the metaphysical, which is based on, well, I mean, I have a whole theory of this, but basically the simplest way of understanding metaphysics is to understand that it takes language for granted. It's like the way, let's say, mathematicians talk, as though the numbers are all the way up, always out there waiting for someone to discover them. The mathematicians are very annoyed if you tell them that, this is really a human invention, There weren't any numbers when the Earth began to circulate around the sun, but they get very upset. They're true Platonists. Right. But metaphysics is based on the idea that language, too, is sort of kind of a neutral medium that we discover rather than develop out of some anthropological need. And this obsession with the idea of language as a sort of neutral background for things has really perverted the whole study of the origin of language. You right. can't get people to recognize that language is essentially comes about because of a human need, not because it's sort of ingrained in the fabric of existence, and like Plato's ideas basically are the beginning of philosophy. I won't go any further.
So when did you discover Violence and the Sacred?
Well, it came out in 1972, I think. And as soon as I read it, I realized that this was, this made much more of an impression on me than Mensonges Romantiques, which I thought was a great piece of literary criticism. And I also, I found the study of desire fascinating, but it didn't, I realized that what he had done is taken the triangle of Mensonges Romantiques and expanded it to a circle. In other words, if everybody is mediated by everybody else, you have a circle around the center. And that is how, of course, every ritual and, in fact, every human act that takes place, there's always a kind of a scene. And the scenicity of the scene is based on a kind of mutual mediation among the people around the periphery. But so I didn't recognize all that right away, but I could see that this was a real attempt to understand the human in a much more, I thought, more satisfying way or more profound than anybody had done before. That's, I considered that Girard was the true successor to Durkheim, and that Durkheim understood that religion was a kind of an incarnation of the human community, but he didn't have a concrete scenario for this, whereas Girard had a scenario. And of course, as you probably know, if you're familiar at all with my work, Girard never accepted my version of the scenario, but he wasn't somebody who was too open to other people's ideas. But the source of that was nevertheless in his idea about the emissary murder. Even if I say I even was able to make use of that in my first book on the subject and the origin of language in 1981. But since then, I realized that that's not really the way we should understand the originary scene. But in any case, but the basic idea is still really something that I got from Girard, that we have to understand that language is the child of necessity. It's, you know, it's not just something that we invent because we got so smart and we can't help talking. The way most anthropologists, that's the way they write about it.
Right.
We were getting so intelligent, we just had to communicate our ideas. You know.
What did you think of the second book? I mean, third book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World?
Well, Les Choses Cachées, well, I mean, it didn't have as much influence on me, but I found it very enlightening about his theories of religion. And I have always been impressed by the way he tried to integrate Christianity and Judaism without, and yet show that Christianity can only transcend Judaism by becoming a kind of post-religion, which in his own reasoning leads to a kind of a tragic ending, because it loses the power of religion to prevent violence, and that we have to take responsibility ourselves and so on. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that I have the, you know, I can deal with this sort of prophetic aspect that Girard was. He was something of a prophet, as I'm sure you know, but I'm not. I used to like to say that Girard and I have a lot in common because he's a prophet and I'm a lost. But in any case,
he's a prophet and you're a what? Sorry?
Lost.
Oh, okay.
No, you know, it's fun. But no, but seriously, I was very impressed by it. I was sorry that he had to write it. I recognized why he didn't want to write it. He was always very careful, very strategic, and although Mensonges Romantiques is full of kind of a Christian sensibility, and it ends on a quote from Alyosha and so on, nevertheless, it doesn't present itself as a Christian book. And in La Violence et le Sacré, he's extremely careful, and I think he even says so later on, that he didn't want to mention anything about the Judeo-Christian.
Yes.
And which, you know, I can understand that, but I mean, it's something I would never have thought to do, you know. Girard thought in those terms. So when I saw the, you know, Les Choses Cachées, I thought that now he's sort of coming out of the closet, so to speak, as a Christian thinker. But I wish he had been able to do it on his own. It's sort of unfortunate that he had these interlocutors who were, you know, it's not a very pretty system where you have these people who just ask you questions, you know, oh, great man, can you tell me about this? And so, you know, it's sort of embarrassing, but I understood that that was because he was so reluctant to get this stuff out there. He was reluctant to talk about his Christian beliefs, and he needed people to kind of prod him to bring this out. So, you know, that's how I understood that, because he certainly was capable of writing his own books, for heaven's sake. You know.
Don't you think he needed Jean-Michel Hougourlian to develop the interdividual psychology part of the book?
No, I think that Hougourlian, who's still around, of course, was played an important role. That's true. He felt the need for somebody with some psychoanalytic background, and because Girard was always very impatient about other theorists. Yeah. Like, you know, I remember toward the end of his life, he made some comment that, you know, I've never really understood Lacan or something like that. Although he was actually the one who recommended I read Lacan when I was at Hopkins. I remember that because I got a copy of Lacan's Écrits.
Right.
But, and I guess Lacan had been at that conference, although I imagine he told me that before the conference. I can't remember now. It's a long time ago. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'm not sure about the contribution of Guy Lefort, but in any case, I mean, I don't want to say Hougourlian didn't contribute at all to the book, but let's face it, it was basically, he had originally wanted to have all three names on the cover, and then apparently the publisher told him, you know, you are the one that we want to highlight. So, I mean, it's a sort of, no, I mean, I don't blame him for this, but I just find it curious that he, as I say, a man who was so capable of writing his own books, he felt the need for this. I'm not sure, though, that Hougourlian was the key to answering that question, though. I think it was because he he felt a bit, in those days, the idea of coming out as a Christian was sort of, he felt that it was, give him a kind of an identity that he didn't quite want to assume. He didn't want to be known as a Christian thinker, which I can understand, because I think his revolutionary aspect is that he made Christianity, or he saw the anthropological content of religion in general, and in particular of Christianity.
Right. From all of his books, I would imagine you've read his books, and from all of his books, which book do you like the most? If I can ask you that question.
Well, I mean, I think that La Violence et le Sacré, although it's sort of, sort of one-dimensional, I think it's his most important book because it does present an outline of his anthropology. Des Choses Cachées is certainly a major work. I would say that the first three are really the ones you have to read. And of course, if you like his Clausewitz book, which is the last that he wrote with Benoît Chantre, it's very different from the others, but it also shows what a mastery of history he had. He was originally a student of history, and he really knew his European history. He had a very deep knowledge of historical phenomena in a sense that very few literature professors have. And you can see that in his Clausewitz book, Achevé Clausewitz, or what do they call it in English?
Battling to the End.
Yeah, right.
Right. Well, what was your personal opinion of that book?
Well, I thought it was, it was sort of in his apocalyptic vein, but perhaps, but not certainly relevant to understanding the 20th century. He saw Clausewitz as being a kind of prophet of the total war, which hadn't really taken place in Clausewitz's day. And then I think at the end of the book is essentially an attempt to find some sort of post-war synthesis. And I'm not sure there's even, I only read that book once and it's been a while, but I was quite impressed by it, if only showing a totally different side of Girard's intellectual personality.
Right.
But I would say that of the three books, and of course you have his Dostoevsky book, which I read with great pleasure back in the early days. But it's much more thorough treatment of Dostoevsky than the Mensonge Romantique. But I would say that those three books really sum up the essence of his thought. And his other books like The Scapegoat and so on. I mean, I read them, but I don't think they add much to his overall intellectual contribution. I think that you can really appreciate Girard after just reading those first three major works.
Right. Did you ever teach Girard at UCLA?
Oh yes, I mean, I used to teach courses as well. The whole idea of generative anthropology. But I taught a course on Girard and Derrida, and I talked about Girard a great deal at UCLA in seminars. I don't think I ever had a seminar just on Girard, but I certainly made him the focal point of my course on Girard and Derrida. And then when I started giving a seminar on generative anthropology, I would always, maybe begin with Durkheim or something, but basically I always saw Girard as the beginning of this. And then you could call him the grandfather or whatever, but I mean, he was definitely the major source of generative anthropology. So we read, we would probably read La Violence et le Sacré and so on, and talk about the importance of his, of his theory that preventing violence is the key to the human, basically. That humans are too violent to be able to keep the peace using animal means, that we needed to develop language and religion and so on, because the mimesis became too strong to be able to keep control of without basically a sign system and without the notion of deferral, which of course is Derrida's point, which I think, well, he never accepted that, but I mean, I think it's a very positive addition to his theory, but he wasn't open to that kind of, he wouldn't want to see this as somehow an advance over his theory. But I would say though that without Girard, I would almost certainly not have developed the kind of thinking that I have, because it was really his idea that it's a simple idea, right? It's like almost a one-liner: necessity is the mother of invention. But no one ever applied that to language. They always think of language as a kind of bonus,
Right. So right now you're doing anthropoetics. So can you tell me a little bit more about anthropoetics?
Well, the story, at UCLA, over the years, when I wrote the Origin of Language, I was still fairly early in my career. Well, not that early, but I had a student there who took one of my seminars where I talked about Girard and a few other things, and he encouraged me to give some seminars on this theory. So I believe it was in 1987 that I started giving these seminars on generative anthropology. That was, and in 1990 we held a little colloquium of the students who had been in several of these seminars. A few of them came from Irvine, by the way. They would drive up there. It's about 50. Well, it's about 50 miles. And so I had a number of students at Irvine who would come to these seminars, and so we formed a little group. And in 1994, the MLA had a second. We applied to have a special session of the MLA for our group, and we had basically 4 speakers. And as a result of this, because the internet was sort of getting started then, and I was always something of a computer buff, I thought it would be an interesting idea to start an e-journal. It started in 1995, which is when you started studying at Stanford, I guess. And we've never missed an issue, although I may have to miss one this year because of all the, But so in 1995, we started this, and I also started writing my chronicles, which later people started calling blogs, even though the word blog didn't really exist in 1995. But, like these sort of quasi-weekly chronicles, I'm up to number 670 at the moment. And then in 2007, Andrew Bartlett, who teaches in Vancouver, he had a little group of Western Canadians who were interested in this, including, I think, the son of Cesario Bandera, whom I'm sure you're familiar with.
Sure.
But he was teaching up there somewhere, or working up there somewhere. So they put together this little group, and this led Andrew to decide to put together a conference. And so in 2007, we had our first generative anthropology conference. And, at first it was a one-off thing, but it seemed to be kind of useful for the group. And so we persuaded one of the members to hold one the following year. And since then, we've had it every year. Unfortunately, we had to postpone it this year, but hopefully we'll be back next year in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be in Israel. And sort of ironically, we had to take a sabbatical this year because of the virus. But so it's been, and it's sort of become the center of our activities. In other words, most anthropoetics articles now come out of the papers people write for that, which is one of the reasons why I'm having trouble putting together an issue this year, because people are saving their papers for next year, so they don't want to publish them.
Right. And the focus of it is really the generative anthropology, basically, your field of anthropology.
Well, it is, but the group is very, shall I say, Girard friendly. In fact, if you look on our website, you see that we accept people who aren't really very interested or in generative anthropology, but who try to apply René's ideas to things. Obviously, I'd rather have people, deal with a synthesis that I've attempted to create, rather than simply, deal with Girard as an independent entity. In which case, the group, actually, I should have mentioned, the group that held that conference was a kind of spin-off from COV&R, or the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But some of the meetings of COV&R had become so, well, kind of de-intellectualized, shall I say. And so a group of the members of the group, without being disloyal to Girard, felt that there should be a separate organization to deal with GA. And so, so basically the organization exists essentially in these conferences. But, and anthropoetics, of course, is linked to it. But, it's a small group, but it's somehow survived after all. It's survived, we've had, 13 conferences so far. But
wonderful.
The spin-off of the COV&R, I think COV&R today is much less of an intellectual operation than it used to be, because it's kind of ecclesiastical in tone and so on. And so, I mean, I had my ups and downs with COV&R. I was the first member. I was the first lifetime member of the COV&R's governing board, but you wouldn't know it to see how they deal with my ideas. In fact, when René was around, they used to invite me to speak at COV&R regularly.
Sure.
And I mean, to give a plenary speech. And, but as soon as Girard was no longer there, instead of saying, well, we don't have Girard, but we can have Gans, they said, rather, we don't want Gans. I haven't been back there since 2004. That's, 16 years. But, I'm not, it doesn't bother me too much.
Yeah. Do you still keep in touch with Andrew McKenna and
I can't say we keep in touch regularly, but for instance, last year in New York, we had our GA conference in New York City, and Andrew was there along with Sandy Goodhart. In fact, unfortunately, they talk more than anyone else, but that's because these old guys, they're kind of used to talking. But it was nice to see them. Now, Andrew, of all the Girard, the true Girardians, if you like, Andrew was always the one most open to my ideas and the most generous about them, in a way that very few of the others were. But Andrew has always been very supportive. In fact, he's on the editorial board of Anthropoetics, and he has written a couple of articles for us. But above all, he's always a kind of invigorating presence,
Wonderful. Well, he also went to Johns Hopkins. He was a graduate.
Oh, yeah, well, he and Sandy Goodhart are, Sandy likes to talk about us as a kind of the first students of Girard, that I was first, and Andrew was second, and he was third. I said, you could be first if you want. I don't really consider that very good.
Well, you do have that famous reputation of being the first student, graduate student of Girard.
Well, I've heard that, but I once tried to verify it at Hopkins, and I discovered that they consider that the name of the director of your dissertation is some sort of confidential,
I see.
Whereas in most places they print the names of the directors on the, when they make it into a volume, they have the names of the 3 people who signed it or whatever. Whereas Hopkins doesn't do that apparently. Yeah, but I think in any case, any time there's any kind of Girardian meeting, I've never met anyone there who studied with Girard before I did, although obviously people did. He taught in several places before.
Professor Gans, let me ask you, is there 1 or 2 good memories you have of René?
Yeah, that's something I actually sort of prepared, in the sense that it's something I've always thought about. I can name, I mean, I'm sure I have many, but there are two incidents that I think are specific, particularly significant. And one, when I was just a first or second year student, and I realized that Girard was a Christian, and so I remember asking, and we always spoke French together, but so I remember asking him, well, how can I can understand that Jesus is a kind of exemplary figure, but how can you say that he's the Son of God? and Girard, well, do you know what Girard answered to me? He said, "Nous sommes tous fils de Dieu. We're all the sons of God." That really impressed me because, after all, coming from a Christian, that's a strong statement. It's not just saying we're sort of vague. In other words, it sort of straddles the fence between a purely humanistic view of Christianity and the divine view. And I think that was really his mentality. But it was also, a very warm kind of thing for him to say to me, as though, well, don't feel left out. You're a son of God too. And I thought that really expressed the kind of generosity of his religious views. And the second is when in 1978, he invited me back to Hopkins, hopefully to take up a position there. But that was a complicated thing. I don't want to go into too many details, but I guess something in my unconscious told me it would not be a good idea. So I somehow managed to kind of screw that up. But that was when I first got the idea of generative anthropology, the idea of the origin of language. And so before leaving, I gave a little talk in the department, because Hopkins was great about that. You could just say, I'd like to give a little talk next week, and all the graduate students would show up. That's something that you can do in any other department I've ever seen.
Right.
And so I gave this little talk where I presented some of these ideas. I can't tell you which ones. And at the end of the talk, Girard said to me, sometimes a little thing like this that doesn't seem important can be the basis for a whole new way of thinking, or something like that. He was very encouraging. And I thought that was a very, very warm thing to say, especially since I hadn't really performed very well at Hopkins. But he could see that there was something important there. And I thought, it was a part of the kind of basic generosity that he had that allowed me to always feel a sense of warmth toward him, even if he wasn't too interested in my, in my ideas. But he also encouraged. He could see that, a sense of personal encouragement. So
Why do you say he was not very interested in your ideas? I don't understand why you say that.
Well, he wasn't. I mean, the one time he actually said something about my thought, which was in that book that, I don't remember the title, but it was just put together by the Brazilian fellow, Cesar, somebody or other. And, the guy asked him, well, what do you think about Gans's idea? And he says, basically, Eric is very smart and he's done some good work, but I don't think he really understands the mimetic theory. So, but I figured he was an old man by that time. And so I didn't, when I wrote a recent article I wrote in the Polish journal about Girard, I could have, I put in a footnote that I didn't want to discuss that because it didn't seem, a polemic with somebody who is no longer around, but above all, that it wasn't really faithful to his, to the essence of his mentality, which was much more generous. That here he was just sort of talking off the top of his head. But I mean, it's true that Girard was not the sort of person who, really would sit down and study my idea and say, hey, yeah, this is, this is an improvement over what I said. I mean, he wasn't that. You have to accept him for what he was. He was a kind of a, charismatic figure, and he had faith in himself, and he couldn't get out of himself, but that wasn't really necessary. I mean, he was certainly a major figure, and as I say, without him, I can't imagine having come up with these ideas. So
Sure.
I'll always be grateful to Girard, and I always think of him as, in a way, the founder of generative anthropology, and is, or at the very least, one of the roots, the chief source. Because Derrida's ideas are important, But Derrida by himself doesn't really give you a notion of anthropology.
Right.
You still kind of get out of metaphysics through metaphysics, which leads to nice paradoxes, but it doesn't tell you, where does language come from?
Right. Professor Gans, one question I want to ask you. I did my undergraduates at Cornell University, and when I was graduating, Cornell was the bastion of the deconstructionists, and actually Derrida came to Cornell and gave a lecture.
Jonathan Culler teaching there.
Jonathan Culler was there, exactly, and absolutely. So Cynthia Chase was there, the whole deconstructionist. John Klein was there. Richard Klein was there. He was my dissertation thesis advisor at Cornell. And I met with Derrida, and he was very friendly, and I had him sign my book, and he signed it for Babak in friendship, and everything was beautiful and everything. But when I discovered Girard, and I read Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World and his books, I realized Girard's thought is such a huge universe, such a vast and huge universe, that Derrida's deconstruction and thought is nothing but a single drop compared to Girard's universe. It's nothing compared to Girard's universe and thought. So what do you make of that? I mean,
Well, I think that, I wouldn't go that far. As I say, first of all, I have no grief for the deconstructionists. They never showed me any respect, even far less than Girard, but either of us, really. The reason his universe is vast is that he begins with religion, and whatever else you can say about religion, it's about human beings trying to relate to the forces that have, created them or that they've created, and that transcend them. And so there's a transcendental aspect. Yeah, exactly right. The people like Derrida I don't know if Derrida ever really wrote anything very interesting about religion. I imagine he wrote a few things, but it's all basically philosophy is the source of all wisdom, that kind of thing. Whereas Girard's one guy who, he had the nerve to say, philosophy isn't really that important. And I've always been more philosophy oriented than he, but I recognize the importance of that. You can't take philosophy too seriously. And, whenever I meet an analytic philosopher, it confirms my dissent.
I remember he gave a talk to a Christian group at Stanford, and he said, "I'm not a philosopher. I want to make this clear. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm a thinker." So he wanted to make that clear, that he's not a philosopher, but he's a thinker. So that was very, very grand of him to make that clarification and consider himself a thinker, and that's what he was. And
he was very impatient with philosophy, and I think that has always stood me in good stead. If can't think of a special sentence or moment, but if I learned, that's something I learned from René, not to take philosophy too seriously. Playing with words doesn't solve all problems. And he was always very skeptical of that kind of stuff. So,
right.
Whereas most intellectuals, you talk about Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Is there a particular book of yours that you wrote that's particularly Girardian?
Well, actually, they're putting together this fellow Jürgen Jürgensen. I don't know if name mean anything to you, but well, he's a member of COV&R and so on. He's Danish, and I met him some years ago. He's not a young man, but in any case, he decided, I don't know exactly why, but he decided to put together two collections of my works, and the first one is called René et moi. And it includes texts where I talk about Girard, and I try to develop Girard's ideas, and it's a rather interesting selection. Some of them from my chronicles, but also a few others that I published, and also this very recent article that I published about Girard and the deferral of violence, which came out in this Polish journal. I don't remember the title. It just came out last year. But that's for So that certainly kind of will give you an idea of my writings about Girard better than anything I could do, because he brings together these different works. So I've never like written a book about Girard. But in the old days, I did write articles about him, sort of presenting his ideas in some way. You know, like back in even in the 70s, I wrote some articles in French that were published in French journals where I talked about Girard's ideas. So, you know, even before I developed my own theory. So I have had some role in that. You know, essentially, I don't feel that we should think about these things in personal terms. You know, it's ideas are ideas, and whatever an idea can do is helping the human race discover itself. You know, you're not sort of promoting one person and so on. And I think that's basically how Girard looked at it too. Even though he, like all of us, he had his personal vanity, but you know, who doesn't?
Right. And could I ask you one last question?
You can ask me anything.
Well, I have here. If you were to summarize Girard's theory, what do you think would be the key concepts? I would say it goes with mimetic desire, then would be contagion, then would be scapegoating, and then would be sacrifice. Did I leave anything out?
Well, certainly mimetic desire is the key, but not just mimetic desire, but I mean what mimetic desire means and what are its consequences, and in particular the notion of violence. I mean, after all, violence and the sacred, you know. And now I don't think violence is the sacred, which Girard sometimes sounds as though he sort of means, but nevertheless, the sacred is about transcending violence, and Girard certainly understood that. But otherwise, well, I think that he made perhaps too much of the notion of sacrifice. I've pointed this out because he was a Christian and he thought of Jesus as the kind of the exemplar, and therefore, but I think he errs in sort of retrofitting Jesus into the origin. I don't think that the originary scene, as he describes it, with a central scapegoat figure, doesn't seem to me it corresponds very well to what we know about primitive man. And you just have to look at those cave paintings. There's not a single cave painting that shows a human being being sacrificed. Now, you can say, well, we couldn't, you know, it was a taboo and so on. But I mean, it makes much more sense to see a bunch of hunters standing around a bull or a water buffalo, because that's sort of the way human beings got their food. And so I think that human sacrifice, and I think you could say this about the binding of Isaac too, you know, the binding of Isaac where they have a human sacrifice which is replaced by an animal. Well, that's not really a very good piece of history. That's a sort of retroactive. Clearly, animal sacrifice preceded human sacrifice. You could have murders, and God knows there are plenty of murders, but when it comes to sacrifice, sacrificing an animal which gives everyone something to eat is much more important. So, you know, as I say, I don't want to get into a polemic about this, but so I think that his basic, the key to Girard's idea is, first of all, that religion is really closer to anthropological truth than philosophy, and in particular Judeo-Christian religion. And second, that the revelation of, the main revelation of religion, if we understand it correctly, is that the human is the one species that is more of a danger to itself. I don't know if he ever said this, but I'm sure he would have endorsed it. The human is the one species that is a greater danger to itself than the outside world is. And I think that sort of sums up why we need religion, why we need language, why we need culture, and so on. And I imagine he might agree with that, but in any case, I think that's sort of the key to his oeuvre. I mean, he started out in talking about the novel, because he's talking about desire which leads to violence, and the whole process of that book is, it gets more violent as it goes along because the internal mediation becomes more intense and so on. And we shared a great love for Dostoevsky. I remember my first literary experience as a teenager, I must have been about 13 or 14, is reading Notes from Underground. And I never forgot that first sentence where he says, "I am a spiteful man. I think my liver is diseased." I mean, I could tell that Girard was somebody I was going to like just knowing he wrote a book about Dostoevsky.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Gans, for taking the time and sharing all your thoughts and memories on Professor René Girard. I greatly appreciate it, and would love to meet you sometime soon and partake in your anthropology conference sometime.
Well, you certainly are welcome to come next year to Bar-Ilan University if you have the, and then participate for that matter. Most of our people have some kind of Girardian background. But it's been a real pleasure to meet you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. In fact, I'm glad that you're not 20 years old. It's sort of much easier to talk to you than to I don't know why I thought you would be. Okay, well, thanks a lot in any case. I really, it's really been fun.